It is nearly impossible to forget the horrific attack earlier this year at SeaWorld. The attack that left a trainer dead, drowned by a killer whale. The water looked calm, glassy, safe, but beneath it, danger lurked. Elena Price believed she knew the orca better than anyone. Years of trust, years of training. She thought they were partners. But nature has its own rules. Break them and the consequences are swift. What happened to her wasn't rare. Others have faced the same fate. And when their stories surface, you might see these animals in a way you never imagined. Number 9. Kasatka's attack. When Ken Peters dove into the tank, he didn't know he would be fighting to get back out. The evening crowd at SeaWorld San Diego's Shemu Stadium was loud, restless, and waiting for the show's big finale. It was November 29, 2006. 39-year-old trainer Ken Peters was in the tank alongside Kasatka, a 5,000 pounds female orca. She had spent most of her life in captivity. The pair had worked together countless times, and both knew the choreography by heart. She was supposed to surge upward, carrying Peters high above the surface before he dove cleanly from her nose into the water. That is not what happened. Without warning, Kasatka clamped her jaws around Peters's foot and yanked him down. The water closed over them in an instant. From the stands, the moment seemed strange at first, almost like part of the act. But the longer she stayed under, the more uneasy the silence became. Beneath the surface, Peters was being dragged toward the bottom with no way to break free. Seconds passed slowly, each one stretching until the crowd's cheers faded to confusion. When they finally emerged, Peters kept his voice calm, speaking to her, stroking her back in slow, deliberate movements. It was a trained response meant to settle her. But Kasatka dove again, pulling him deep. It became a cycle. He surfaced, lungs burning, trying to breathe. She pulled him under again. This continued for nearly 9 minutes. From the pool's edge, staff scrambled to act. A net was stretched across to block her. If Peters managed to get away, the audience sat frozen. They were unsure if they were watching a performance or a fight for survival. Kasatka eventually loosened her grip, which was enough for Peters to push free. He swam toward the side and pulled himself out of the water. His wetsuit was torn open at one leg, revealing a broken foot and deep puncture wounds. In the days after, marine behavior experts analyzed the footage. They noticed something missed during the chaos. From another tank, Kasatka's calf had been vocalizing during the show. The calls were sharp, insistent. Some believed hearing her calf had agitated Kasatka. This, they believed, had amplified her stress in the confined tank. Stress like that can escalate quickly when an animal built for the open ocean is kept in a small enclosure. What made the incident even more unsettling was that it wasn't the first time. Kasatka had targeted Peters before, once in 1993, again in 1999. Each time he survived, and each time the risks were overlooked in the name of entertainment. Peters later said he never thought Kasatka intended to kill him. Even during those long minutes at the bottom, he believed she was acting out of agitation, not malice. Others saw it differently. They pointed to the hours of training, the restrictive space, and the separation from her calf. They argued that if you remove a wild orca from her natural environment, keep her in concrete walls, and demand daily performances, incidents like that night are not accidents. They are consequences waiting to happen. Number 8. The attack on Annette Eckes. The show was supposed to be lighthearted. It was April 20th, 1971 at SeaWorld. Cameras were ready and the audience was smiling. The star of the act was a 17-foot killer whale named Shemu. And the plan was straightforward. Annette Eckes, the park's public relations secretary, would ride Shemu across the water in a brief but attention-grabbing stunt. She wore a bikini instead of a wetsuit. It was something that had never been done with this orca before. The first moments went smoothly. Eckes balanced on Shemu's back and glided across the tank as the crowd clapped and photographers captured every second. But what no one knew was that the performance was about to take a sharp turn. Without warning, Shemu tossed her off his back. The impact with the water was sudden and cold. Before Eckes could react, Shemu lunged forward and clamped his jaws around her leg. The pool's atmosphere shifted instantly. The playful cheers were replaced by screams and shouts. In the water, Shamu dragged her in tight circles, his grip unrelenting. From the deck, divers launched into the tank, each armed with long metal poles. They tried to force his mouth open, pushing against his powerful jaws. But the risk was clear. One wrong move could cause Shamu to bite down harder, and the damage could be catastrophic. What would happen if they pulled too hard? Would it tear muscle? Would it crush bone? The struggle continued, seconds stretching into what felt like minutes. Ekis was being towed through the water, blood clouding around her leg. The crowd continued to watch in frozen disbelief, with some covering their mouths. Finally, through coordinated effort, the divers managed to pry Shamu's mouth open just enough for Ekis to break free. She was pulled from the water, her body trembling from shock. The moment she reached the edge, she collapsed. Her injuries were severe. There were deep punctures and torn flesh that would later require 25 stitches. She was rushed to the hospital, her bikini still wet, the color of her skin pale from blood loss. When asked later why it happened, Ekis admitted she didn't know. She had been told afterward that no woman had ever ridden Shamu before, and that no one had ever done so without a wetsuit. Whether that fact made any difference remained unclear. She took legal action against SeaWorld, determined to hold them responsible. Initially, a court sided with her, but the decision did not last. The award she received was overturned on appeal, leaving her without the compensation she had hoped for. The incident fueled ongoing questions about the risks of using wild predators for entertainment. Orcas are built for the open ocean, covering vast distances in their natural habitat when confined to a tank, forced into repetitive shows and placed in close contact with humans. How long before instinct overrides training? That day in April provided one more answer, a violent one. Number 7, when Keto turned on his trainer. It was the morning before Christmas in 2009, and preparations for the holiday show at Loro Parque were in full swing. The trainers moved with their usual precision, with animals gliding through the water as music echoed faintly across the stadium. In one of the pools, 29-year-old Alexis Martinez worked with Keto, a large male orca he knew well. The two had performed together many times before, and they had developed a strong bond. But on that December morning, something about Keto's behavior felt different. During the routine, Alexis attempted a stand-on spy hop. It was a maneuver where he balanced on Keto's back as the whale rose from the water. But instead of a smooth lift, Keto tilted unexpectedly. Alexis lost his footing and slipped into the pool. At first, it didn't seem serious. He floated beside Keto, waiting for the next move. But the orca didn't follow through. From the viewing platform, another trainer noticed Keto's unusual positioning. The whale hovered between Alexis and the stage platform as though blocking his exit. When Alexis began to swim toward the platform after the underwater signal was given, Keto closed the gap slowly at first, then with deliberate force. The trainer on the platform signaled Keto to disengage using cues that had always worked. This time there was no reaction. Keto pushed Alexis downward with the rostrum, pinning him against the bottom. Emergency backup signals flashed, but the orca remained focused on the trainer in the water. For a brief moment, Keto surfaced for air. Trainers hoped it was over, but in seconds he dove again, emerging with Alexis balanced across his rostrum. His jaws stayed shut, but his grip of control was clear. Then, almost without warning, he released him. Alexis sank slowly toward the pool floor. The deck exploded into action. Staff scrambled to isolate Keto, but the whale stalled near the gate, resisting every attempt to move him. Only when a safety net was lowered into the water did he finally swim into the adjoining pool. That gave the rescue team the opening they needed. When Alexis was brought to the surface, it was already too late. His injuries were fatal. He had suffered massive internal bleeding, torn organs, severe compression fractures, and multiple bite marks. The postmortem confirmed what everyone feared. Alexis had been killed by the orca he had trained for years. In the days that followed, difficult questions were raised. This attack had not come from nowhere. Marine mammal experts had long made their concerns known about the environment at Loro Parque. The orcas lived in confined tanks without a stable social structure. No dominant female was present to keep order. Social tensions simmered constantly. The boredom was so severe that whales tore strips from the pool's waterproof lining just to have something to do. These were creatures evolved for vast distances, deep dives, and complex relationships. Trapped in a tank, instincts can warp, pressure builds, and when that pressure finds an outlet, the results can be catastrophic. The death of Alexis Martinez was not just a tragedy for those who knew him. It showed what can happen when the raw power of the ocean is caged for entertainment. Number 6. Inside the Loro Parque Orca incident. It was the kind of day at Loro Parque in 2007 that began like countless others. But by the time the show was over, one trainer would be fighting for her life. Claudia Valhart had been with the park for 4 years. She knew the whales by name, by temperament, even by the scars on their skin. One in particular stood out. A 3,000-pound male named Tico. He had been brought to the facility from SeaWorld a year earlier along with 3 others. All separated from their mothers at an early age. Instead of forming a peaceful group, they became unpredictable. Among them, Tico ranked lowest. That position came with a cost. The others lashed out often, leaving deep rake marks along his body. On some days, the scars were so fresh that visitors could see the raw lines through the water. Trainers watched as he occasionally hauled himself onto the edge of the pool, almost as if escaping the group's aggression. Requests to return him to SeaWorld were made, but rejected. So, Tico stayed, carrying both visible and invisible wounds. By the time of the incident, Claudia had worked with him for about a year. The attack happened during a rehearsal before a scheduled show. She and Tico were performing a maneuver known as the foot push. The trainer plants their feet against the whale's rostrum while the animal propels them across the surface. Normally, the movement ends with both surfacing in unison. That day it did not. Without warning, Tico dragged her under. The water swallowed them both and he drove her toward the bottom. A few seconds later, he burst upward, but instead of releasing her, he pulled her back down again. Over and over, the cycle repeated. What goes through a trainer's mind in those moments? Panic, a desperate calculation. On the pool deck, her colleagues rushed in, shouting commands, splashing, doing anything to distract the whale. At last, they pulled her from the water. Claudia's injuries were severe. Her forearm had snapped in 2 places. She had damage to a lung and needed immediate hospital care. The fact that she survived was remarkable enough. The fact that she returned to work after recovery was even more striking. After that day, rules changed. Tico was barred from any interaction with junior staff. No trainer, regardless of experience, was allowed in the water with him again. It is easy to frame such moments as a simple case of an animal turning violent. But Tico's history told another story. He had been shuttled between facilities, removed from his family, forced into groups of strangers, and exposed to constant stress. Every scar, every behavior was shaped by that world. When you look at him in that light, the incident with Claudia becomes more than an attack in a pool. It becomes part of a larger question. What happens when a wild creature is kept in an artificial space for years, pushed into a life that will never resemble the ocean it came from? Number 5. When a killer whale landed on its trainer. The audience had come for a show, but what they were about to see would not be part of any scripted performance. It was November 21, 1987 at SeaWorld San Diego. Families filled the stands, children leaning forward as trainers and orcas moved in unison across the water. Among the performers was 26-year-old John Sillick, a man who had spent 2 years working with these massive creatures. The routine that afternoon was one he had done before. Climbing onto the back of a female orca, he prepared for a stunt that felt familiar, almost automatic. But pools holding predators that weigh several tons are never truly predictable. Without warning, a male orca named Orca 2, close to 11,000 pounds in weight, surged upward and out of the water. In the next instant, he came crashing down, not into open space, but directly onto the female Sillick was riding. The force threw them all beneath the surface. The crowd's cheers stopped. Trainers rushed toward the pool's edge. For a few moments, the only sound was the churn of water settling. When Silik surfaced, it was clear he was in serious trouble. The injuries were devastating. His pelvis was crushed, his hips and back broken. Multiple ribs and both legs suffered fractures. 6 major surgeries would follow. Surgeons placed more than a kilogram of metal in his body, plates to stabilize his pelvis, fused vertebrae to hold his spine. The damage was permanent. Recovery began at the University of California, San Diego Medical Center. It was slow, painful work. In the early days, movement was nearly impossible. Over time, doctors described him as stable and physical therapy began. Silik later admitted in an interview that he was learning to walk again. SeaWorld acted quickly after the accident. Trainers were no longer allowed to ride orcas. Performing in the water alongside them during shows was banned. Safety protocols changed, and behind the scenes so did management. The park's president was dismissed along with 3 other staff members. But changes on paper did not erase the questions rising in public discussion. What had gone wrong? Was it simply an accident, as SeaWorld claimed, or a sign of deeper risks in the way these animals were trained and used? Silik decided to sue. He alleged that the dangers of working this closely with orcas had never been fully explained to him. The lawsuit was settled privately. As part of the agreement, Silik could not speak about internal details, and all legal records, thousands of pages, were sealed. SeaWorld told the public the cause was unfortunate timing, not aggression. Some accepted that answer, others doubted it. After all, these were wild animals living in confined pools, repeating the same routines in front of crowds every day. So, the question remains, was that day in 1987 truly an unpredictable fluke? Or was it a glimpse into the hidden tension between orca and trainer, one that would surface again in the years to come? Number 4. Dawn Brancho's final performance. Crowds had come to SeaWorld Orlando for years to see her. Dawn Brancho, 40 years old, carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed to put even the largest killer whales at ease. Families leaned forward in their seats, children clapping as massive black and white bodies cut through the water. To the audience, it looked flawless. But beauty can hide danger. And in this case, the danger was as real as the water in the tank. Among the orcas Dawn trained, one stood apart. Tilikum. He was enormous, more than 12,000 pounds, a giant even by orca standards. He had spent over 3 decades in captivity, performing for crowds and living in concrete enclosures. Those who worked with Dawn said she treated him with unusual patience, never rushing him, always reading his movements. She trusted him more than most would dare. Yet she knew the job carried risks that no level of skill could erase. She had spoken before about the unpredictability of such powerful animals. The date was February 24, 2010. The noon show had ended and the crowd at the Dine with Shamu area was still seated. Dawn was near the edge of the pool close to Tilikum, her face almost touching his sleek skin. It was the kind of quiet moment that made visitors believe in a bond between human and animal. Then, without warning, everything changed. Witnesses would later disagree on what happened first. Some swore he yanked her in by the ponytail. Others believed he took hold of her shoulder. Either way, Dawn was pulled into the water with a force no human could fight. The air filled with shouts. In the water, Tilikum no longer seemed the gentle partner people had admired just moments before. The attack did not end quickly. Nearly an hour passed as he tossed her, dragged her, and kept her from surfacing. Trainers on the deck ran about, throwing nets, shouting commands, offering food. Nothing broke his grip. The bond they thought they understood was gone, replaced by something no one could control. When they finally maneuvered him into a medical pool and he released her, hope was already lost. Dawn's injuries told the story of what had happened in brutal detail. Her arm was gone. Her scalp had been torn away. Her jaw was shattered. Her ribs were broken. Her spinal cord was severed. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma and drowning. For 45 minutes, Tilikum had refused to let her go. After that day, Tilikum was removed from public performances. He spent his remaining years in isolation, floating in the back pools with little activity until his death in January 2017. It was not the first death linked to him. The attack reignited questions about what captivity does to an animal that in the wild can swim 100 miles in a single day. If a life of confinement can warp the mind of a human, what can it do to an orca? Number 3. The keto incident. On a warm July afternoon in 2004, an orca made a choice no one expected. SeaWorld San Antonio's Orca Show was in full swing, and trainer Steve Abel stepped to the pool's edge with the confidence of a man who had spent years working beside these enormous predators. Out in the water, Keiko, a young male orca, circled slowly. He was still maturing, but his size already dwarfed the man on the platform. Moments earlier, they had moved together through a practiced routine. But now, something in the whale's pace shifted. His movements grew sharper, less predictable. Without warning, Keiko surged toward Abel. The water exploded around him as the massive body slammed into the trainer, driving him under. The applause stopped. Gasps cut through the humid air. From the surface, only brief flashes of movement could be seen. A fin slicing the water, a human arm struggling upward. Each time Abel surfaced for a breath, Keiko was there again, ramming forward with terrifying precision. Staff members watched from the edge, unable to act. The power in the orca strikes was impossible to counter. Every second felt stretched thin, like the whole pool was holding its breath. Several witnesses later recalled seeing Keiko's jaws open as though he might bite. Whether that was his intent, no one could say. What they could see was the intensity in his behavior, a kind of focus that made it clear this was no part of the script. Minutes passed in a blur of splashing water and desperate evasions. Then came an opening. Keiko shifted just enough for Abel to act. The whale blocked the ramp, the only clear way out, but Abel made a split-second decision. He pushed off the orca's back, using his own momentum to vault toward safety. Another trainer reached out, gripping his arm and pulling him clear. Behind them, Keiko crashed down on the ramp with startling force, as if reacting to the escape. Incredibly, Abel walked away without physical injury. Later, he admitted he could not explain the sudden aggression. Keiko was nearing breeding age, a stage that can bring unpredictable changes in behavior that might have played a role. Still, Abel believed one thing had kept him alive. He stayed calm. Panic, he thought, would have been fatal. But the question remains, was this attack the result of a passing mood or something deeper? Orcas in the wild roam vast distances, hunt with their pods, and navigate complex social lives. In a concrete tank, those instincts have nowhere to go. Boredom, frustration, and stress do not fade in such conditions. They grow. Keiko's attack was not an isolated moment of violence. It fits into a wider history of incidents in marine parks worldwide. When animals built for the open ocean are confined, their natural rhythms fracture. What happened that afternoon in San Antonio was not only a near tragedy for one trainer, it was a sign of a much larger problem we still choose to keep behind glass and steel. Number 2. SeaWorld's 1987 Orca attack. Candu had been part of the San Diego shows for more than 9 years. Yet something in her never seemed to settle. Trainers noticed it in subtle ways. Her movements could be stiff. There were moments when she resisted cues. It was as if a part of her never truly accepted life inside the tank. On March 4, 1987, that unease surfaced in a way no one expected. The afternoon show was already in motion. 21-year-old trainer Jonathan Smith was in the water riding on Candu's back. Nearby was another female orca, Kano, just 10 years old at the time. The performance had been rehearsed countless times, but mid-routine, without any sign of trouble, Candu veered. Her jaws clamped around Smith, and in an instant he was pulled under. The water closed over them. He was dragged to the very bottom of the 32 FT pool, then abruptly brought up again, only to be released. From the stands, it almost looked like part of the act. Jonathan even managed to wave, perhaps to keep panic from spreading, but the danger was far from over. Before trainers could pull him away, another orca surged forward. The hit was brutal, sending him beneath the surface again. Imagine the force it would take to knock the air from your lungs instantly. Beneath the water, visibility was poor. He had no way of knowing where the next strike would come from, but it came then another and another. The whales pushed him, rammed him, and dragged him down repeatedly. Each trip to the bottom left him weaker. 2.5 minutes is not long when you are sitting in a theater, but underwater with a ruptured kidney and a deep cut to your liver, it feels endless. By the time the ordeal was over, Smith's upper body was covered in bites and scrapes. His recovery was slow. Even standing took effort, but the physical wounds were only part of the damage. What would it feel like to return to a place where you nearly lost your life to perform beside the same animals that had dragged you down? A year later, Smith took legal action. His claim was clear. He said SeaWorld never warned him of the real risks. He alleged there was no formal training for the dangerous roles he was assigned. Officials, he claimed, presented the job as safe, even with whales that could act unpredictably. The lawsuit accused the park of fraud, emotional distress, and battery. The case never went to trial. It was settled behind closed doors. Part of the agreement was a gag order. That meant no interviews, no records released, and no public answers to the questions many still had. Whatever was said in that room stayed there, and the truth of what happened behind the glass walls of that tank remained sealed away. Number 1. Orca attack at Pacific Realm. On the surface, Pacific Realm seemed like a place where wonder lived year-round. Families wandered through vast glass tunnels as stingrays glided overhead. Children pressed their hands to the cool acrylic walls, staring wide-eyed at swarms of fish. But beyond the exhibits and souvenir stands, there was one reason the park drew more visitors than anything else. His name was Nyarus. Nearly 20 feet long and weighing close to 10,000 pounds, Nyarus could lift his entire body out of the water in a breathtaking breach. The crowd would erupt, cameras flashing, the air buzzing with applause. To the public, he was a marvel. To Pacific Realm's management, he was the park's heartbeat, the one performer they could never replace. But keeping a spectacle alive meant long hours, relentless schedules, and no room for rest. When Elena Price arrived at the park, she was full of quiet determination. She had studied marine biology in Oregon, drawn by a lifelong fascination with the ocean. Working with Nyarus felt like a dream. She learned his habits, his signals, and built trust through patience. The way she described it, Nyarus was more than an animal. He was a partner in the water. Colleagues admired her commitment. Though some whispered their concerns, you could never forget that Nyarus was a top predator. Then came the changes. At first, they were small. He began slapping his tail against the tank walls during training. Sometimes he ignored commands. To some trainers, this was a clear sign of stress. One veteran with years of experience went to management urging them to give Nyarus time off. The request was brushed aside. Profits came first. The veteran walked away from the job, warning that trouble was coming. Elena stayed. She believed in the bond they shared, certain she could steady him. For a while, it seemed she might be right. But on an afternoon in front of a packed amphitheater, the tension in Nyarus broke through. The first show passed without incident. For the second, Elena entered the water with her usual confidence. Trainers on the platform noticed his movements had a sharper edge, but she waved off concern. The performance began as planned. Then, during the final routine, Nyarus swam straight toward her. Instead of breaching beside her, he struck with terrifying speed. His jaws clamped down. Shouts filled the air. Trainers hurled buoys, tapped poles on the surface, and gave every command they knew. Nyarus dove, pulling her with him. The water churned violently before turning red. No one could go in without risking their own life. Minutes dragged. Finally, he released her. Elena was pulled from the water, limp and unresponsive. Trainers hauled her from the water and started CPR. It was too late. The stands were silent. Moments earlier, thousands had been cheering. Now they sat frozen, staring at the pool where Nyarus had retreated to the far end, calm again. The image of Elena's final moments would never leave them. The park's most prized attraction had become the center of a tragedy, and the question no one could escape was simple: had they pushed too far?